The sound was white at first. A wall of static, the universe's background radiation translated into audio, ancient light, the afterglow of creation, rendered as a formless hiss. He turned the squelch up. The hiss receded to a murmur. He swept the frequency selector slowly across its range, listening for the signature artifacts of equipment malfunction, heterodyne whine, ground loop hum, the characteristic warble of a failing oscillator. Everything sounded healthy. The equipment, for all its age, was in remarkable condition. He parked the frequency selector at the midpoint of the HF band, wrote a note in the log, and reached up to remove the headphones. That was when he heard his name. Marcus. He froze. The voice had come through the headphones, through the receiver, which meant it had come through the antenna array, which meant it had come from outside. From the sky. It was a human voice, thin with distance and degraded with noise, but unmistakably a voice speaking unmistakably his name. He left the headphones on. Nothing for 30 seconds. 40. A full minute of white static. He told himself it was pareidolia. The brain's insistence on finding pattern in noise. Soldiers in Vietnam had reported hearing their mothers calling their names in the static of the jungle. Communications workers throughout history had hallucinated voices in the white noise of long shifts. He had worked 16 days alone in a desert. This was not a mystery. This was neurology. He took off the headphones and went to bed. He did not sleep. It came again the next night. He had not planned to sit at the primary station after dark, but he found himself there at 11:10, the operation center lit only by the amber glow of the equipment indicators, the headphones pressed to his ears, the frequency selector parked at the same coordinates. Anyone receiving, please respond. This is an emergency broadcast. His breath stopped. It was his voice. Not similar to his voice. Not a voice that shared some quality with his voice. It was his voice, the exact timbre, the particular resonance in the lower registers, the slight nasality that came from a childhood deviated septum. He had heard his own voice on recordings enough times to know it exactly, the way you know your own handwriting. There was no question. But the transmission was not clear. It fractured and reassembled between bursts of static. He reached for the frequency trimmer and narrowed the bandwidth, reduced the noise floor by 3 decibels. Better. Not perfect, but better. Designated operator Vale, please respond. If anyone has signal on this frequency, this is priority 1. I am transmitting from Station 1 Alpha, bearing 315, range approximately 40 miles. I have information that is time critical. Please respond. Station 1 Alpha. Marcus looked up from the equipment and stared at the wall, because he knew that designation. He had seen it in the base's original construction documents, which were stored in a fireproof cabinet in Building 2. Station 1 Alpha was the original military code name for this base. This installation. The place where he was sitting right now. Bearing 315, range approximately 40 miles. He did a rough calculation in his head. 315 degrees bearing from this station put you northwest. 40 miles northwest put you in the middle of the lava fields, a vast badlands of broken basalt where nothing lived and the only people who went were geologists and the occasional lost hiker. He pressed the transmission key. His mouth was dry. This is the operation center at Station 1 Alpha. I'm receiving your signal. Please identify. The static swelled, then thinned. I know it's strange, the voice said. I know exactly what you're thinking, because I thought the same thing. I need you to listen. Who are you? A pause that felt like the pause before a diagnosis. My name is Marcus Vale. I'm a communications technician. I'm transmitting from a secondary array 40 miles northwest of your position, and I need you to understand that I'm transmitting this message on a date of October 22nd, 1947. Marcus sat very still. That's not possible. I know. But the date stamp on this transmission is real, and when you verify this frequency and its characteristics against the archived records in Building 2, you will find that it is consistent with standard HF propagation from 1947 equipment. Please verify. I'll wait. You'll wait, Marcus repeated, his voice flat. I've already waited 78 years. Another few minutes won't change anything. He verified it. It took him an hour, because he did not want to verify it, and verification required him to pull the original receiver calibration logs from Building 2, which were in a deteriorated state, and cross-reference the signal characteristics he was receiving against the theoretical propagation profile of 1947-era transmission equipment. He wanted to find the error. He worked through the calculation 3 times, changing his assumptions each iteration, looking for the place where the logic broke. He did not find it. The signal's propagation characteristics, its multipath delay, its ionospheric skip distance, the specific distortion profile of its carrier wave, were consistent with transmission from hardware that had not existed since before Marcus Vail was born. He sat in Building 2 for 10 minutes with the calculation in front of him. He looked at the numbers the way you look at a word when you've read it too many times and it has stopped meaning anything. Then he went back to the operations center and put on the headphones. "All right," he said. "Talk." "I was stationed here in 1945, the voice said. "Your voice." "My voice." "It doesn't matter. What I'm about to tell you is the reason I'm still out here in 1947, sitting in a secondary array in the lava fields, transmitting on a loop timer because I ran out of power 3 days ago and I'm operating on battery backup. I have maybe 4 hours of signal left. You need to hear this." Marcus pressed his pen to his notebook. His hand was steady. That surprised him. "Go ahead." In September of 1945, 1 month after the war ended, this installation received a signal. Not from a human source. Not from any recognizable transmitter. It came from approximately 200,000 miles, which is roughly the distance to the moon, and it was structured. Mathematically structured, like a sequence, a pattern designed to be recognized as intentional. The base commander at the time, a colonel named Reeves, reported it to Washington immediately. Washington sent 3 men, not military, not intelligence, 3 men in civilian clothes who arrived within 48 hours and spent 2 weeks analyzing the signal. Then they closed the base. Sent everyone home. Told us it was a natural phenomenon, an artifact of a solar event, nothing to worry about. But you didn't believe that. I was the operator who first received the signal. I had been a communications technician for 4 years. I had never heard anything like it, and I knew what a natural phenomenon sounded like. What we received was not natural. It was like hearing something speak in a language that you didn't understand but absolutely knew was a language. There was grammar to it. Syntax. The carrier wave wasn't just carrying noise, it was carrying intent. Marcus had stopped writing. He was listening the way you listen to something you know will change you. The 3 men from Washington. I followed one of them the night before they left. His name was, I never found out his name, actually. I followed him to the secondary array in the lava fields, where I found him using our equipment to transmit a response to the signal. A coded response. He was not reporting to Washington. He was reporting to whatever had sent the signal in the first place. You're saying the government was already in contact with them. I'm saying someone in the government was. And I'm saying that whatever had sent that signal, they weren't offering us a greeting. When I analyzed the mathematical structure of what we received, in the 2 weeks before I was shipped home, I found something that the 3 civilian analysts had either missed or deliberately hidden from their report. The signal was not a message. It was a boundary condition. A fence line. A territorial marker indicating. The static swelled. Marcus hit the noise gate, reduced it back, indicating that the area of space they had designated as their operational domain included the entire solar system. They were not introducing themselves. They were serving notice. Marcus did not sleep that night. He lay on his cot in Building 3 and stared at the ceiling and listened to the generator hum and thought about a man who was also him sitting in a desert in 1947, running on battery power, talking into a microphone. He thought about the mathematics of the thing. About whether it was possible, actually, physically possible, for a signal to cross 78 years of time and arrive coherent in his headphones. The short answer was no. The short answer was firmly, categorically, immovably no. But the short answer had failed him in the last 3 hours, and he was not sure he trusted it anymore. There was another possibility, of course. He was experiencing a psychological event. Extended isolation, combined with the suggestive environment of an abandoned military base and the normal human desire to find meaning in pattern, had produced an auditory hallucination complex enough to generate internally consistent narrative content. His brain had supplied a voice using its own stored model of his voice, and was now delivering a paranoid fantasy structured around his professional knowledge of signals intelligence. This was possible. This was probably likely. The problem was that the signal's propagation characteristics had been real. He had measured them. The equipment didn't hallucinate. He sat up at 3 in the morning and went back to the operations center. "You're back," the voice said, when he put on the headphones. There was something almost warm in it. "I need you to tell me how this is happening," Marcus said. "The transmission. The physics of it." "That's the second part," the voice said. "And it's the part that required me to stay out here for 2 years after the base closed, because it took me that long to understand it. What the signal in 1945 actually was. Tell me. They didn't come through space, the voice said. They came through time. And when they arrived, they didn't choose a single entry point. They chose every entry point simultaneously. They fractured the causal structure of the last 80 years, not dramatically, not visibly, but in the way that a hairline crack in a foundation is invisible until the building falls. They folded the time stream back on itself at specific coordinates, creating loops, creating echoes, creating points where signal transmitted in 1947 would arrive in 2024 because from their perspective, 1947 and 2024 are the same moment. They exist outside linear time entirely. To them, the 20th century is not a sequence. It is a single object. Marcus thought about the dishes on the tower, all aimed northeast, all aimed at the same point, as if they had been oriented to track something specific. What do they want? He said. A long pause. The static breathed in and out like a living thing. That's the question I didn't understand until last year. 1946. I was out here alone, in the lava fields, living in a tent and running experiments on a portable receiver I had borrowed, stolen, from a government depot in Albuquerque. I was trying to map the temporal anomalies, the fold points in the causal structure. And I found something. Another pause. The military actions since the end of World War II. The Cold War. The proxy conflicts, the arms races, the nuclear near-misses. I mapped them against the temporal fold points. Marcus, every major military engagement of the last 2 years, every conflict that has brought humanity to the edge of war with itself, has been occurring at a temporal fold point. Every single one. Marcus felt something cold move through him that had nothing to do with the desert night. You're saying the conflicts aren't. I'm saying that at every fold point, the temporal distortion is severe enough that military units, human military units, have been firing on each other while believing they are firing on something else. The distortion creates a perceptual overlay. A soldier in one time perceives a different threat than what is actually there. The enemy they see is not the enemy that exists. In some cases the enemy they are fighting is themselves, a different temporal version of themselves, brought into phase by the fold. That's not possible. You keep saying that, the voice said, and there was something that might have been a sad laugh in it. You said it about the signal. You said it about the transmission. I know the feeling. I lived it. But Marcus, I need you to understand this, because this is why I have spent 2 years alone in a desert building a transmitter out of salvaged parts and running it on a timing loop designed to activate in the exact month and year that I calculated you would be sitting in that chair. Humanity is not at war with an external threat. Humanity has been tricked into fighting itself. The conflicts, the tensions, the violence, it is all happening between human factions that cannot see each other clearly because the temporal fold makes each side see something that is not there. They are using us as a weapon against ourselves. Marcus stared at the wall of the operations center. At the layers of equipment, each generation piled on the last, each one trying to see further, hear more clearly, reach deeper into the sky. Why? He said. What do they get from it? Space, the voice said simply. If we destroy ourselves, the solar system is uncontested. They don't need to fight us. They just need to make us fight each other, and then move in when it's quiet. It is a strategy so efficient that from their perspective it barely qualifies as violence. It is pest control. The sun came up and Marcus was still at the station. He had 4 pages of notes, written in a hand that had grown progressively less stable as the night went on. Outside, the desert burned copper in the early light, and the tower dishes held their fixed orientation, patient and attentive. He tried to organize the information into categories: verifiable, plausible, impossible. The problem was that the categories kept shifting. The things he moved into impossible kept developing empirical support and migrating toward plausible, and the things he placed in verifiable were requiring him to revise his understanding of what verification meant. He made a decision. He pulled the construction documents from Building 2 and spent the morning searching for any record of a secondary installation in the lava fields 40 miles northwest. He found it in an appendix to the original engineering survey, dated 1944, Site B, designated Auxiliary Monitoring Station, construction suspended 1944 pending material allocation. Foundation and primary conduit completed. There was a set of coordinates in the margin, handwritten, in pencil that had faded to near invisibility. He had a compass. He had a truck, a Forest Service pickup that the contractor had left on site. He had 3 hours before the sun peaked and the heat became serious. He drove northwest. The lava fields were not dramatic. They were not like the volcanic landscapes in films, with dramatic cones and glowing flows. They were just broken rock, sharp, black, fractured basalt stretching to the horizon, the remnant of eruptions so old they had been eroded flat, the landscape humbled by time into something that looked less like geology and more like grief. The truck bucked over the access road, which was barely a track, and Marcus drove with the window down, the coordinates written on a piece of paper taped to the dashboard. He found Site B at the end of a dry wash, behind a formation of boulders that would have been invisible from any distance. The foundation was there, exactly as the survey described, a concrete pad, 40 years of desert growth creeping over its edges, a corroded conduit stub rising from the center. And beside the foundation, a structure that had not been in any survey document he had found. It was a shelter. Corrugated metal, roughly constructed, the kind of thing a man built with salvaged materials and patience and no help. It had been there for a very long time. The metal was rusted to the color of the landscape, almost invisible against the basalt. The door, which was heavy canvas stretched on a wooden frame, had been tied shut from the outside with a length of copper wire. Someone had tied it shut from the outside, which meant someone had left. Marcus untied the wire and went inside. The interior was 12 feet by 12 feet, maybe, and smelled of dust and old oil and something else, a smell he could not name but recognized as the smell of a place where a single human had lived for a very long time in conditions of considerable privation. There were crates, shelving, a cot frame without a mattress. And at the center, on the concrete pad, a transmitter. It was remarkable. It had been built from components that were recognizable: vacuum tubes, copper coil, capacitors, a frequency selector that looked like it had been cannibalized from a naval unit, but assembled in a configuration Marcus had never seen. The transmission array that fed it was outside, he realized, the copper conduit from the foundation connecting to a wire antenna strung between two poles driven into the lava. The whole setup was powered by a bank of lead-acid batteries in various states of depletion. The batteries were dead. Had been dead for decades. Except, on the workbench beside the transmitter, there was a timing mechanism. A clockwork device, hand-built, with a mainspring and a gear train and an output shaft connected to a relay switch. The spring was fully wound. And the mechanism had been running, was still running, ticking away in the silence of the shelter, and the position of the output shaft indicated that the relay would close in approximately 11 hours. Marcus stared at the timing mechanism for a long time. 11 hours from now, the relay would close. The relay was connected to the transmitter. The transmitter was connected to the dead batteries, which could not power it. Unless, he looked again, unless the timing mechanism was also connected to the generator in the corner, a small gasoline unit with a half-full tank that he had not noticed because it was behind the crates. A generator that, if the timing mechanism was functioning as designed, would have started automatically, charged the batteries over a period of hours, and prepared the transmitter to operate exactly when the relay closed. The clockwork had been wound, he estimated, sometime in the last 2 weeks. The mechanism required winding every 21 days to maintain accuracy. Someone had been here recently. Someone had wound the mechanism, filled the generator, and left. Someone had prepared this transmission for tonight. He sat down on the bare cot frame and held the thought very carefully, the way you hold something that might break. He was the only person at the base. He had been the only person for 16 days. He had not left the base perimeter until this morning. But someone had been here. Someone with access to the site. Someone who knew the exact timing required to prepare this transmission for receipt on this specific night, which meant someone who already knew that Marcus Vale would be sitting at the primary receiver in Building 5 receiving the signal. Which meant someone who already knew the contents of the signal, because the signal had already been sent 78 years ago, in 1947, and was already traveling through whatever temporal fold allowed it to arrive in the present, and the person who had wound the clockwork was not preparing a new transmission, but completing a loop that already existed, that had already closed, that was already done. Marcus went back to his truck. He drove back to the base. He did not eat. He sat at the primary station and waited. At 8:47 in the evening, the signal returned. Stronger now. Clearer. The battery bank at Site B fully charged by a generator that had been running for hours, the transmitter warmed up, the timing relay closed exactly on schedule. You went to Site B, the voice said. Yes. What did you find? I found the shelter. The transmitter. The clockwork timer. He paused. Someone wound it. Recently. It wasn't me. No, the voice said. It wasn't. Then who? The static moved. Somewhere in it there was a quality that Marcus recognized as reluctance, the way you can hear reluctance in a person's silence before they speak. Think, the voice said. Think about the temporal mechanics I described. The fold points. The way the distortion works. If two temporal instances of the same person exist simultaneously within a fold zone, if 1947 and 2024 overlap at this specific location, what does that mean for the physical actions of each instance? Marcus thought. It means, he said slowly, that an action taken in one instance could manifest in the other. Physically. A person in 1947 performing an action could produce physical results in 2024. Yes, the voice said. Or vice versa. Or vice versa, Marcus repeated. He looked at his hands. I wound the clockwork, he said. Yes. I haven't wound it yet. I just found it today. It was already wound when I got there. Yes, the voice said. Think about that carefully. He thought about it. He thought about it the way you think about something that requires you to revise the direction of time itself, to hold a concept of causality that runs in both directions simultaneously, where cause and effect are not a sequence but a structure, where what you will do and what you have done are the same action, just seen from different positions along the timeline. When do I go back? He said. On the 28th. Before midnight. And I wind it. And you wind it. And you fill the generator. And you leave. And I receive the charged batteries, and I make this transmission, which you are hearing right now, which you have already heard, which caused you to go to Site B, which led you to wind the clockwork. The loop is closed. It has always been closed. You are not doing something new. You are completing something that is already complete. That's a closed causal loop, Marcus said. With no origin point. No origin point, the voice agreed. That's what they do. They find the temporal fabric and they fold it into these closed structures, events that refer only to themselves, that have no beginning and no end, that cannot be traced back to a cause that exists outside the loop. Every major human conflict since 1945 has this structure. It's self-sustaining. It requires no ongoing intervention from them. They wound the clockwork once and left it running. Marcus pressed his hands flat on the desk. He felt something that was not quite fear and not quite grief but occupied the space between them. How do we stop it? A very long pause. Longer than the others. That is what I have been trying to determine for the last 2 years. I have been alone out here in the lava fields working on that question since October 1945. I have not been home. I have not spoken to another person. I have eaten canned goods and thought about this problem continuously, and I believe I have an answer. Tell me. You cannot break a closed temporal loop from inside the loop. Any action you take that is designed to break the loop is already part of the loop. It has already been taken. It is already accounted for. The loop contains itself. The only way to introduce a change that is not already part of the structure is to act from outside the causal framework entirely, to make a choice that the loop cannot anticipate because it has no point of origin from which to encode it. What does that mean practically? It means you have to make a choice that has no cause. A decision that arises from nothing, no memory, no reason, no sequence of prior events. A genuinely free action, which is the rarest thing in the universe, because almost everything we do is caused by something that came before it. The static pressed in from all sides. The amber glow of the equipment indicators pulsed slowly, like something breathing. What's the choice? Marcus said. You have to choose not to go back to Site B on the 28th, the voice said. You have to choose not to wind the clockwork. If you do that, if you break this transmission by refusing to complete it, the loop fails. The temporal structure loses coherence. The fold collapses. The perceptual distortions that have been making human military forces fight ghost versions of themselves begin to resolve. It will take time. It will not be immediate. But the machinery will stop. And if I don't go back to Site B, Marcus said carefully, this transmission never happens. You never send it. Because I never wound the mechanism. Yes. Which means I never came to Site B. Which means I never heard this transmission. Which means I had no reason to go to Site B. Which means the mechanism never got wound. Yes. The loop collapses. Everything that happened inside it becomes, the static surged, and through it Marcus heard something in the voice that he could not name for a moment, and then he could, and it was the sound of a man who had been alone for too long and had finally found someone to talk to. Becomes uncertain. The events may still have occurred. The knowledge I have acquired may persist. Or it may not. I cannot tell you what happens to a consciousness that exists inside a temporal loop when that loop ceases to function. I don't know if I continue, or if I simply stop having been. Marcus was quiet for a moment. You've been alone for 2 years, he said. Yes. In a metal shelter in a lava field? Yes. Working on this problem? Yes. And the answer you arrived at is that I have to make a choice that breaks this transmission. That means you never sent it. That means you spent 2 years working on a problem and the solution is that no one will ever know you solved it, including you. A long, long silence. The static was almost gentle. That's correct. Why are you telling me? Marcus said. If you knew I was going to break the loop, you wouldn't have sent the transmission. And if you didn't know, then when you sent it, you didn't know whether I'd choose to break it or not. Which means you sent it anyway. You built the mechanism, you wound the mechanism, you made the transmission, without knowing whether any of it would matter. Without knowing if you'd continue to exist afterward. Yes. Why? The voice was quiet for so long that Marcus thought the transmission had ended. Because the alternative was to say nothing, the voice said finally. And I could not do that. Even if no one ever knows. Even if I ceased to have existed. I could not find this and say nothing. That would be. Another pause. Shorter. That would be the wrong kind of alone. Marcus sat at the station for the rest of the night. The transmission continued, fragmentary, looping through the same information in different orders as the timing relay cycled the transmission on a repeat interval, the way an emergency broadcast loops. He listened to all of it. The temporal mechanics. The mathematics of the fold. The pattern of conflicts mapped against distortion coordinates, which he cross-referenced against his own knowledge of global events and found, with a cold and nauseating precision, to be accurate. At dawn he was still at the station. He had not made a decision. He thought about the loop. About the way it enclosed itself, referred only to itself, began and ended in the same moment. He thought about the fact that he had already wound the clockwork, had already done it, in some sense, from the moment the loop closed, and that the transmission had already existed for 78 years before he was born, waiting for him to sit in this chair. He thought about a man alone in a metal shelter in 1947, running on battery backup, working a problem in complete isolation, arriving at an answer that required him to trust a version of himself across 7 decades to make a specific choice. A man who had built a mechanism for a purpose he could not guarantee. Who had made a transmission into an uncertain future. He thought about what it meant to make a choice with no cause. He thought about whether that was actually possible, whether any human choice was truly uncaused, and he thought it probably wasn't, that genuine freedom in that sense probably didn't exist, that everything he would do in the next 4 days would be the result of prior events, prior information, prior character. That the feeling of choosing freely was not the same as the fact of it. And then he thought about something else. If the loop required him to go to Site B on the 28th, if the loop encoded his compliance as a structural element, then his decision to go was not a free choice. It was a determined outcome. The loop had already accounted for it. But if the loop was a closed structure, self-referential, with no external origin, then it also had to have accounted for everything he had heard tonight. The transmission was part of the loop. His knowledge of the loop was part of the loop. His understanding that refusing to go would break it, that was part of the loop too. Unless the transmission had been designed not to persuade him, but to do something else. Unless the man in 1947 had understood something that Marcus was only now beginning to see. The choice to break the loop was also inside the loop. It was also encoded. It was also already accounted for. Which meant that the only genuinely free choice, the only option that had no prior cause within the structure, was the one that seemed most constrained, going to Site B on the 28th, winding the clockwork, completing the loop. Not because the loop demanded it, but because he chose it, independent of what the loop predicted, independent of what the voice had told him to do, or not to do. The loop had been designed, by whatever intelligence had constructed it, to be broken by a human who received this transmission and made the obvious choice to resist. The temporal architects had encoded human resistance into the structure. Human defiance was the key that kept the door locked. The man in 1947 had not been solving the problem. The man in 1947 had been the problem. His transmission, his careful argumentation, his appeal to Marcus's conscience, all of it was part of the trap. The loop sustained itself not by demanding compliance but by producing exactly the kind of person who would refuse to comply. Marcus felt something open up beneath the logic of this realization, a vertiginous drop, because if he was right then it meant the voice, himself, had been unknowingly serving the architects. Had spent 2 years in isolation working toward a conclusion that served their purposes. Had transmitted the solution to a problem that was itself the problem. And if he was right about that, then his refusal to go to Site B was also inside the trap. His realization was inside the trap. Everything was inside the trap, because the trap had been designed by minds that existed outside linear time and could encode every possible human response into its structure. He pressed his fingers against his temples. The only uncaused choice, he thought, was the one made by a person who had discarded all the information. Who had heard nothing. Who did not know about temporal folds or alien architects or closed causal loops or the fate of humanity. A person who had simply been asked, "Do you want to go for a drive in the desert on the 28th? He thought about what that person would say. He thought about what he would say if he knew nothing. He thought he would say yes. He thought he would go. Not because of the loop, not because of the transmission, not because of what he had been told or warned or reasoned through. He would go because he was curious, and because the desert was beautiful in the early morning, and because there was a shelter in the lava fields that smelled of human habitation and solitude and effort, and something in him responded to that. He thought he would wind the clockwork. Not to complete the loop. Not to resist the architects. Simply because it seemed like the right thing to do, when you found evidence that someone had tried very hard to leave a message for the future, to honor the trying by making sure the message got through. He wasn't sure that was freedom. He wasn't sure anything was. But he got up from the station, turned off the receiver, and went to bed. He went back to Site B on the 27th. Not the 28th, a day early. He told himself this was because he wanted to check the generator fuel levels before the timer was supposed to close, which was true and also not the reason. He brought extra fuel, which was also true and also not the reason. The shelter was exactly as he had left it. The clockwork ticked. The generator sat cold and waiting. The batteries were partially discharged from the initial transmission, and the generator needed to run for several hours to bring them back. He wound the clockwork. The mainspring took tension beautifully, the gearing precise and careful, the work of someone who had understood mechanisms. He wound it for the full required rotation, which would give it 30 days of operation, more than enough to transmit on schedule for the rest of the month and then fall silent. He filled the generator and started it. It caught on the third pull, coughing to life in the desert silence, settling into a steady run. He checked the fuel reserve and estimated it would run for 40 hours, which covered the transmission window with margin to spare. He stood in the shelter for a moment, listening to the generator and the clockwork and the specific silence that surrounded both sounds. He thought about the man who had built this. The solitude it required. The faith, not in any person or institution, but in the general proposition that the future was worth addressing, that someone would be there to receive the message, that the effort was not wasted even if it was. A faith made entirely of work, the way certain kinds of faith are. The kind you build with your hands because you have nothing else to build it with. He went outside. The lava field stretched to every horizon, broken and black and very old. The sky above it was the dense blue of deep autumn. The antenna wire stretched between its poles, patient and vertical, aimed at the ionosphere, aimed at the future. Marcus stood in the desert for a long time. Then he drove back to the base, sat down at the primary station, and opened his maintenance log. The base had no name anymore. Whatever designation the army had given it in 1943 had been scratched from every ledger, redacted from every declassified document with a black rectangle so thorough it looked like a wound. The locals in the nearest town, a flyspeck called Ardmore, 47 miles southeast through Pine Forest and Alkali Flats, called it the Ear. They had called it that since the war, though none of them had ever seen inside its fences, and most of them had the good sense not to ask why the government kept a single contractor out there every few years, running maintenance on equipment that nobody talked about. Marcus Vale had not asked either. He had simply taken the job. It paid $4,000 a month for 3 months of solitary work, which was exceptional money for a 34-year-old man who had spent the last decade in the middle frequencies of military radio work, who had no wife to miss him, no dependents, no pets, and one very ordinary apartment in Albuquerque that he would be happy to leave for 90 days. The contract was standard government language, maintenance of existing signal infrastructure, integrity testing of receiving arrays, documentation of any anomalies. Nothing exotic. His supervisor at the contracting firm, a soft-spoken woman named Joanna Price, had shaken his hand and said, "It's a quiet posting. You'll be fine." She had said it the way people say things they want to be true. He arrived on a Thursday in October, when the desert had turned copper and the sky had the dense, mineral blue of deep autumn. A government sedan dropped him at the gate, handed him a key card and a laminated sheet of emergency numbers, and drove away without the driver ever turning to look at him. The gate was chain link, 12 feet high, topped with concertina wire that had rusted into a ruddy lace. Beyond it, a dirt road cut between 2 hills and disappeared. Marcus stood there for a moment with his duffel bag and his equipment case and his laptop, listening to the silence. It was enormous. It had texture. It was the kind of silence that only existed in places where something had been removed. He let himself in. The base was a cluster of 7 buildings arranged in a rough crescent around a central communications tower. The tower was the tallest structure, maybe 60 feet, lattice steel with 3 rotating dish arrays mounted at different heights, each one large enough to park a car inside. They were all facing northeast. Marcus noticed that immediately. All 3 dishes pointed in precisely the same direction, which was not typical for a monitoring array designed to cover multiple frequencies. They had been aimed. They were looking at something specific. He filed that observation away and went to find his quarters. Building 3 was residential, 4 cots, a propane kitchen, a diesel generator humming in the basement, and shelving stocked with 3 months of canned goods and freeze-dried provisions. Building 5 was the operations center, which was where Marcus would spend the majority of his waking hours. He spent the first afternoon walking through it with a flashlight, even though the power worked fine, because he found that darkness revealed things about a room that light concealed. The operations center smelled of old electronics, of solder flux and the specific metallic sweetness of vacuum tubes that had burned at high heat and cooled to nothing. The equipment was layered in archaeological strata. Near the back wall, there was hardware from the 90s, chunky beige workstations, coaxial splitters, patch panels. In front of that, equipment from the 70s and 80s, amber-screened monitors and reel-to-reel recording decks. And at the center, at the primary operator station, the original equipment from the base's construction in 1943, a rack of tube-powered signal receivers, a massive rotary frequency selector with a dial the size of a dinner plate, and a transmission unit with a microphone stand still screwed into the desk, the microphone itself still attached by a braided copper cable. The microphone had not been removed in 70-some years. Marcus held his flashlight close to it and read the manufacturer's stamp on the base, Western Electric, 1941. He put his hand on it. The metal was cold. Perfectly, inertly cold. The kind of cold that meant nothing had passed through it in a very long time. He pulled his hand away, went back to Building 3, and made himself a cup of instant coffee. He sat at the kitchen table and wrote his first maintenance log entry, arrived on site. Initial walkthrough complete. All structures structurally sound. Operations center operational. Equipment layers spanning 1943 to approximately 1998. Beginning systems check tomorrow. He closed the notebook. Outside, the desert clicked and breathed. The first 2 weeks passed with the specific texture of productive isolation. Marcus worked methodically, systematically, the way he had been trained. He tested the receiver arrays from the bottom of the frequency spectrum to the top, documenting signal bleed and interference, cataloging the strange residue of decades of radio traffic that seemed to live in the old wiring like sediment in a riverbed. He replaced blown capacitors, reseated connectors, aligned the dish bearings with a manual adjustment crank that left his arms aching. At night he ate, read paperbacks, and slept the clean, dense sleep of a man who had worked his body honestly. He did not think about the microphone. On the 16th day, he turned on the primary receiver array for the first time. He had been building to it. The tower dishes were the centerpiece of the installation, the actual purpose of the base, and bringing the main array online required that every supporting system be verified first: power conditioning, grounding, antenna feed lines, the signal routing matrix. He had done all of it properly. He had tested each component individually. He had documented everything in the maintenance log with the calm, thorough handwriting of a man who had learned to trust process over intuition. He put on the headphones, sat down at the primary station, and powered on the receiver. Day 17, he wrote. Systems nominal. No anomalies. He closed the log. He sat with the headphones around his neck, not quite on, not quite off. The receiver was dark. He had turned it off this morning. He did not turn it back on. Outside, the dishes held their fixed orientation, aimed northeast at something specific, something that had chosen this solar system as its territory and then waited, with the patience of things that do not experience time as a sequence, for the work to complete itself. Marcus thought about the signal in 1945. Structured. Mathematical. Intentional. A boundary marker. This is our territory. He thought about the man in 1947 who had found this and could not say nothing. He thought about the loop, and whether he had broken it, and whether breaking it was possible, and whether any of the choices he had made in the last 24 hours had been outside the structure or merely a different interior path to the same destination. He did not know. He was fairly sure the architects did not want him to know. Uncertainty was useful to them. A man who was not sure whether he was free would spend his energy examining his choices rather than acting on them. So he made a decision. He made it not because it was logical, not because it followed from the information he had received, not because some calculation had produced it. He made it because he was tired of thinking and he believed in the value of work. He opened his maintenance log again and turned to a fresh page. He began to write. Not the maintenance log. Something else. Everything he knew. The signal of 1945. The temporal folds. The pattern of conflicts. The mathematics of the distortion coordinates, which he had memorized during the night. The name of the 3 civilian analysts and the colonel who had sent everyone home. Every detail, every data point, every piece of information that the man in 1947 had transmitted across 7 decades at the cost of 2 years of his life. He wrote for 6 hours without stopping. When he finished, he had 47 pages. He put the pages in the fireproof cabinet in Building 2, alongside the original construction documents, alongside the engineering survey with the handwritten coordinates in the margin. He sealed the cabinet. He went back to the primary station and sat down. He put the headphones on. He turned on the receiver. White noise. A wall of static, the universe's background radiation, ancient light rendered as formless hiss. He turned the squelch up. He moved the frequency selector to a position he had not tried before. A position he had calculated from the distortion coordinates, not a standard HF frequency, but a derived one, a value that emerged from the mathematics of the fold itself. A frequency that, if his understanding was correct, would resonate with the temporal structure rather than the physical medium. A frequency that would be audible not in air but in time. He listened. For a long time, nothing. Then the static changed. Became less like noise and more like distance. Like the sound of something very far away, heard not with the ears but with some faculty that did not have a name. He pressed the transmission key. "This is Marcus Vale," he said. "Transmitting from Station 1 Alpha. Date, October 27th, 2024. I have information I need you to receive. Please respond." He released the key and waited. The static breathed. He thought about who might be listening. He thought about the man in 1947, and whether the loop between them was closed or still closing, whether it was a circle or a spiral, whether spirals could be infinite or always eventually became something else. He thought about the architects in their position outside time, watching the solar system the way you watch a board game, patient and proprietary, certain of the outcome. He thought it must be something, to be that certain. He thought about uncertainty, and what it was good for. And then, through the static, through the derived frequency, through whatever channel existed between one instance of time and another, he heard something. It was not his voice. It was not any voice he had ever heard. But it was structured. Mathematical. Intentional. There was grammar to it. Syntax. The carrier wave was not just carrying noise. It was carrying intent. He pressed the key again. "I'm receiving your signal," he said. His voice was steady. He was not afraid. He did not know whether what he was about to do was inside the loop or outside it, whether the architects had anticipated this or not, whether any choice he made in this room on this night would matter to the vast and patient intelligence that had decided, decades ago, that humanity was an obstacle rather than a neighbor. He did not know. He began to transmit. Not a warning this time. A question. The next morning, a signals analyst named Priya Chandran, working the early shift at a NOAA monitoring station in Boulder, Colorado, noticed an anomaly in the HF spectrum. A structured signal, heavily degraded, propagating on a frequency that should have been empty. She ran the analysis 3 times. The signal's characteristics were consistent with transmission equipment from approximately 1947, but the content was wrong for 1947. It was mathematical, derived from a specific coordinate system that she did not immediately recognize. She flagged it and sent it up the chain. It sat in someone's inbox for 11 days. On the 12th day, a different analyst, working in a different building, for a different agency, pulled it from the flagged queue and ran it through a different analysis suite. She had a background in theoretical physics. She stared at the derived coordinate system for a long time. She recognized it. She had seen it before, in a paper she had written in graduate school, in 2019, about the mathematics of causal loops. A paper that had received very little attention at the time. A paper she had based, in part, on 47 pages of handwritten notes she had found in a government archive, in a fireproof cabinet, during a research trip that had been, as far as she could remember, entirely routine. She had not thought about those notes in years. She thought about them now. She opened a new document and began to write. 3,000 miles away, in a metal shelter in a lava field, A clockwork mechanism ticked patiently toward its next cycle. The generator ran. The antenna wire stretched between its poles, aimed at the ionosphere, aimed at whatever was listening. The signal went out. It had always been going out. It would always be going out. Whether anyone would finally hear it clearly enough to answer, whether the answer would be the right one, whether the choice made in that answering would fall inside the structure or outside it, whether the architects had calculated for this or had, for the first time in their long operation, encountered something they had not encoded, that was a different question. It was the only question that mattered. It had no answer yet. It was still being asked.